Now let's look at prayer and fasting, a classic sort of feature of the spiritual life in general, but of Lent in a particular way. Fasting was considered by the fathers, to quote to the great scholar Peter Brown, fasting was considered to undo a little the fateful sin of Adam. If you think about it, the first sin was what? Eating something, right? And so fasting, in a sense, is a ritual reparation of that sin of eating. But it's also at the same time, these images sort of come together and they're layered. Not only is it sort of a ritual reparation of the sin of the first sin, right? Refusing to eat when Adam and Eve made the mistake of eating. It's also at the same time an imitation of Christ, right? He, for example, in all the Gospels but John, Jesus refused to the drink that was offered him on the cross, which some of the fathers saw as a type of fast. But it's also an imitation of Jesus' temptation in the desert. Man lives on the Word of God, right? Not food necessarily. And so fasting sort of had those sort of basic features of imitation, right? And biblical allusion. But also from a purely sort of ascetical standpoint, fasting is also a practice in which a person learns to govern or rule his or her body with the mind, and the mind presumably is attuned to the will of God, right? So it's a matter of discipline in that regard. And fasting, as we'll see, enabled the mind of God, enabled the person to just pray better. Augustine taught this, as we'll see in just a moment. So to look at this passage from Leo the Great, from Sermon 39, we see here fasting described as an exercise of sort of rational supremacy. So here in passage, Sermon 39, it says, "Accordingly, dearly beloved, that we may be able to overcome all our enemies, let us seek divine aid by the observance of the heavenly bidding, knowing that we cannot otherwise prevail against our adversaries unless we again prevail against ourselves." That's a powerfully beautiful line. We cannot otherwise prevail against our adversaries unless we prevail against ourselves. For we have many encounters with our own selves. The flesh desires one thing against the spirit, and the spirit another thing against the flesh. That's an echo of Romans 7. And in this disagreement, if the desires of the body be stronger, the mind will disgracefully lose its proper dignity, and it will be the most disastrous for that to serve which ought to have ruled, right? The mind should govern the body, not the body govern the mind, right? That's the proper order of things, Leo is saying. But if the mind, being subject to its ruler, and capital R ruler there, you'll notice, and delighting in gifts from above, shall have trampled underfoot the allurements of earthly pleasure, and shall not have allowed sin to reign in its mortal body, reason will maintain a well-ordered supremacy, and its strongholds no strategy of spiritual wickedness will cast down. Because man has then only true peace and true freedom when the flesh is ruled by the judgment of the mind, and the mind is directed by the will of God. And so fasting is a very human struggle to establish the proper order. The mind rules the body, and the mind is in communion with God, and that's how you have sort of existential peace, so to speak. And of course, this is very simple, and it relates to the emotions and psychology and even nutrition and things like that. And a lot can be said, but it's quite possible that this basic concept of the harmony of mind and body and God, which the ancients, and not just Christians, talk about again and again and again, Goodness gracious, they may, for all our sophistication and pretension, have something, right? This still may be true. And so that's why fasting still has place, I think. Fasting helps us discover ourselves. As St. Augustine says, it helps us find our true self. If you see this passage from St. Augustine, he says, when the soul is freed from the burden of excessive food and drink, it comes to know itself better. Very interesting. For as a man cannot tell from a dirty mirror what he really looks like, so when he is dragged down by food and drink, he thinks himself to be other than he really is. But when the body is brought to a proper state through fasting, the soul comes to know itself and realizes how devotedly it should follow the Redeemer. Very beautiful passage. Again, there's a lot you could unpack here. One is, this idea that fasting helps us discover our true selves. One, I think fasting reminds us of our createdness and of our need for sustenance. And to be reminded of our creatureliness is, especially in our virtual worlds that we live in today behind screens, quite a necessary human truth to remember, to recall. But it's more than that, right? It helps us, when we are spiritually and even physically and bodily healthy. It helps us get nearer to that Eden-like humanity, right? And again, it's hard for us to get our heads around. Why? Because we're basically Gnostics, most of us, right? We think salvation, we think religion is just a matter of intellectual assent to something. No, religion in the ancient mind, religion in the Catholic sense, is mind and body, right? And so Augustine, quite naturally, in a very Catholic way, can talk about fasting and psychology, right? And theology. It's a profound thought, to be honest. But also, again, the beautiful thing about Catholic ritual and Catholic religious acts, spiritual acts, is that the illusions of each act is multiple. Allusions are multiple, I should say. That is, they make reference to all sorts of different things, and it creates a layered milieu of meaning that helps us see the mystery of the thing. And what I mean by that is, mysteriously fasting also helps us imitate the crucifixion, right? It's not just a battle of mind over body. It's not just a project of self-discovery. It's also an imitation of the crucifixion. Again, St. Augustine, Sermon 207, let us also fast and humble our souls as we near the time when the teacher of humility humbled himself and became obedient even to the point of dying on a cross. Let us imitate him in his crucifixion by mastering our appetites and fixing them to the cross with the nails of abstinence. Again, I'll leave that there. It's suffice to say that the meaning of fasting is complex, beautifully complex. I don't mean that. I mean it's difficult to understand. I mean it's layered. It's rich, and it draws us into ourselves, and it draws us closer to the mystery, which is Christ. Right? If the fathers are to believed here, and so and it all brings us to a point of true prayer. Right? If we see ourselves, if we see the crucifixion, if we follow the Redeemer better through this practice of fasting, it aids in our praying, right? Because it helps us see God better. Prayer has a food of its own, it says in Sermon 207, which it is bidden to take without interruption. Right? So when you refrain from human food, from material food, prayer becomes food, right? And again, to truly grasp this, find your nearest monk or nun or very holy person. And that's why he says there, Augustine says, prayer seeks fasting for a companion so that it may be heard, right? Now, let's return to Leo real quick. Fasting is, for Leo, a psychosomatic proof, so to speak, of our willingness and our ability to refrain from evil. So there's a moral element to fasting too. For our fast does not consist chiefly of mere abstinence from food, nor are dainties withdrawn from our bodily appetites with profit, unless the mind is recalled from wrongdoing, and the tongue restrained from slandering. For in a word, to him we offer the sacrifice of true abstinence and true godliness, when we keep ourselves from all evil. Now, why is that? Again, think of the our original story. The first sin was eating, right? Which is why some of the Desert Fathers said, the first sin was not pride, the first sin was gluttony, right? The first sin was eating, the act of eating, and so to practice fasting, it's not tough to connect those dots for Leo, is associated with the fight against evil, the fight against one's own sin. It's like it's a restoration or it's a reparation, I should say, of that first sin. And also this wonderful line from Augustine, which I just love to share, about how fasting literally makes us lighter, kind of like the angels. So by almsgiving and fasting, we add wings of fervor to our prayers, so that they may more easily fly up and reach God, right? We'll talk about almsgiving in a minute. But again, it's just a beautiful little image of the relationship between fasting and praying.